Their camp chairs were facing the woods when they woke up. They noticed it at the same moment, the way people sometimes share a thought without speaking. A quiet awareness settling in, heavy and undeniable. The chairs had been turned. Not slightly, not carelessly nudged by wind or uneven ground. Both camp chairs, folded metal frames with sagging fabric seats, were positioned side by side at the edge of the fire pit, angled inward, facing the tree line with deliberate precision. Neither of them remembered placing them that way. The fire pit itself was cold. Gray ash layered neatly where embers should have been scattered. The air carried a sharp chill, the kind that crept through fabric and clung to skin. Morning light filtered weakly through the canopy, thin and colorless, as though strained before reaching the ground. The forest stood motionless around them, trunks rising straight and close together, their bark dark with moisture. No birdsong, no insects, just the faint whisper of breath and the distant, almost imagined creak of wood settling. They stayed still in their sleeping bags for several seconds, listening. The ground felt too quiet, the silence pressing in on their ears until it rang. Even the usual early morning sounds, branches shifting, leaves stirring, were absent. It felt like waking in a room after everyone else had left. One of them finally sat up. The chairs were still facing the woods. The trees beyond the campsite were densely packed, their lower branches interlocking, forming a natural wall of shadow. Mist hung low among the trunks, drifting slowly, as if reluctant to leave. The light didn't penetrate far. It gathered at the forest's edge and stopped, leaving the interior dim and depthless. They hadn't heard anything during the night. No footsteps, no snapping branches, no rustling near the tents. Yet something had moved the chairs. They rose carefully, boots sinking slightly into damp soil. The ground was cool beneath their feet, faintly spongy, as though it had been walked on repeatedly. Near the chairs, the pine needles lay disturbed, not crushed, but brushed aside in smooth arcs. Too smooth, they checked their surroundings. The food containers were intact. No claw marks, no scattered wrappers. The cooler lid remained closed. Whatever had come through the campsite hadn't been searching for food. It had been arranging things. A shiver crawled up one spine when they noticed the pattern in the dirt. Faint impressions circled the fire pit, shallow depressions where something had stood for a long time. The marks weren't deep enough to be footprints, but they were evenly spaced, positioned as if someone or something had paused there, facing the same direction as the chairs, facing the woods. The air felt colder the longer they stood still. A pocket of chill drifted past, raising goosebumps along exposed skin. When one of them exhaled, the breath fogged briefly before dissolving into the gray morning. They spoke quietly, voices sounding too loud in the stillness, and agreed to pack up early. Neither said the thing they were both thinking, that whatever had turned the chairs had wanted them to look. As they dismantled the campsite, small details began to surface. A boot print near the edge of the clearing that didn't match either of theirs, longer, deeper at the heel. The tent zipper pulled slightly downward, as though tested and then left alone. A fallen branch moved closer to the fire pit than it had been the night before, positioned parallel to the chairs. The forest watched without moving. Every so often, one of them thought they saw motion between the trees, a subtle shift, a darkening shape sliding behind a trunk. Each time they focused, it vanished, leaving only bark and shadow. They finished packing faster than planned. When they shouldered their bags, the weight felt wrong, heavier than memory suggested. The straps creaked softly, the sound swallowed almost immediately by the surrounding quiet. As they prepared to leave, one of them glanced back at the chairs. For a moment, it looked like the fabric had sagged differently, like someone had been sitting there recently. They didn't linger. The trail leading away from the campsite was narrow and poorly defined, winding between thick roots and moss-covered stones. As they walked, the forest closed around them, branches knitting overhead, dimming the already weak light. The temperature dropped in uneven waves, cold pockets sliding past their legs and torsos. The feeling of being watched intensified. It wasn't the sudden fear of pursuit. It was slower than that, heavier. The sense of attention, focused, patient, unblinking, like something standing just beyond the edge of perception, keeping pace without sound. They stopped once, listening. Nothing. Yet when they resumed walking, the ground behind them made a faint, delayed sound. Not footsteps, not quite, more like pressure being released from wet soil. They didn't turn around. The trail began to change subtly. Rocks appeared where they hadn't been moments before. A fallen log seemed closer than it should have been, forcing them to detour. The forest felt tighter, the trees leaning inward, narrowing the space available to move. They spoke less now. At one point, the wind stirred briefly, rustling leaves high above. The sound moved through the canopy in a single direction, away from the campsite, deeper into the woods. Felt less like weather and more like a signal. They walked faster. The light shifted as the sun climbed, but it didn't brighten. Instead, it flattened, washing color from the forest until everything looked muted and unreal. Shadows clung to the bases of trees, stretching farther than logic allowed. When they reached a small clearing, one of them stumbled and nearly fell. The other grabbed their arm, steadying them, and froze. In the soft earth ahead, something had pressed down recently. Not footprints, no distinct shape, but wide, shallow impressions leading off the trail and vanishing between the trees. Parallel to their path. Following. They stood there for a long moment, hearts pounding, the silence pressing in harder than ever. The forest did not react to their fear. It simply waited. They moved on. By the time they reached the edge of the woods hours later, exhaustion had settled deep into their muscles. The air warmed slightly, the light brightened, and the trees thinned just enough to reveal sky. They did not stop until they reached their vehicle. Only then did one of them look back. At the forest's edge, just beyond where the light faded, something stood between the trunks. Not fully visible, not fully hidden. A shape suggested by absence rather than form, its outline hinted at by the way the shadows bent around it. It did not move. It did not need to. As they drove away, neither spoke. Both were thinking of the same thing, the chairs turned carefully toward the woods, positioned at the perfect distance for watching. And the quiet certainty that whatever had sat there was not finished observing. It had simply learned where they would go next. The moonlight revealed markings on their skin. They appeared all at once, as if the light itself had been waiting for the right angle. We had been sitting close to the fire's remains, not for warmth. There was none left, but for the comfort of something familiar. The forest around us was sealed tight with shadow. Tall trunks stood shoulder to shoulder, their upper branches knitting the sky into narrow slits where moonlight leaked through in pale strands. The air was cold enough to sting the lungs, every breath tasting thin and mineral, like stone dust. No one spoke when the markings first showed themselves. It was Mara who noticed, her fingers tightening around her sleeve. She lifted her arm slowly, turning it until the moonlight struck bare skin. What we saw made the silence thicken, as though sound itself had decided to step back. Dark lines traced her forearm, too precise to be scratches, too deep to be dirt. They curved and intersected in patterns that suggested intention, symbols arranged with care rather than randomness. The skin around them was unbroken, smooth to the touch, yet the markings lay beneath the surface, as though something had been written inside her. Then Jonah swore softly. The same symbols marked his neck, curling just below the jawline, disappearing into his collar. Eli pulled back his sleeve, breath hitching, and found them spiraling around his wrist. When I looked down at my own hands, I felt a cold wave of recognition before I saw anything at all. They were on me too. The moonlight intensified the longer we stood there, bleaching the forest of depth. Shadows flattened, distance collapsed. The markings darkened in response, lines sharpening, their edges subtly shifting as if adjusting themselves to the light. When a cloud drifted across the moon, they faded slightly, sinking back toward the color of our skin. When the moon returned, they deepened again. They were reacting. We tried to remember when they had appeared. The memory refused to settle. There were gaps, soft, slippery stretches of time that would not hold shape. We remembered walking into the forest before dusk, the path narrow and overgrown, the smell of damp leaves. We remembered the fire being lit, the sound of wood cracking, the slow arrival of night. Everything after that was unreliable. The forest was impossibly quiet now. No wind stirred the leaves. No insects threaded the air. Even the fire pit seemed wrong, its ash arranged too neatly, as though something had tended it after it died. The moon hung low, brighter than it should have been, its light unnaturally cold. Mara touched one of the symbols on her arm. The skin there felt warmer than the surrounding flesh. Not painful, not numb, alive, with a faint vibration beneath it, like a distant hum carried through bone. The markings began to move, not traveling across the skin. Not yet, but shifting internally, lines tightening, intersections deepening. Watching them made my eyes ache, as though my brain were struggling to process a language it almost recognized. I felt an urge to look away, paired with an equal and opposite need to keep staring. The forest responded. We noticed it in small ways at first. Trees leaning ever so slightly toward the clearing, their bark catching moonlight where it hadn't before. Shadows lengthening in the wrong direction. The air growing denser, pressing close to our faces, our chests. Something was paying attention. When we tried to leave, the path was gone. Not blocked, simply absent. Where we expected open ground, there were trees. Familiar ones, their shapes almost right, their positions subtly wrong. We walked in a straight line and found ourselves back at the fire pit within minutes, our footprints looping in the soil like hesitant writing. That was when we realized the markings were synchronized. They pulsed together faintly, in time with something we could not hear. A rhythm too slow to be a heartbeat, too steady to be chance. With each pulse, a flicker of sensation passed through us. A shared awareness, not quite thought, not quite emotion. Recognition. We understood then that the markings were not wounds. They were interfaces. The moonlight grew brighter, washing the clearing in silver. The symbols responded eagerly now, lines spreading outward in delicate branches, tracing veins, mapping us from the inside out. We felt memories slip loose, faces without names, conversations stripped of context, the certainty that we had slept, deeply and completely, while something worked with careful patience. The forest was no longer merely surrounding us. It was participating. Between the trees, shapes gathered. Not creatures, not shadows exactly, but absences given outline by moonlight. They stood still, watching without eyes. Their presence felt more than seen. The air vibrated faintly, and the markings warmed further, sending a shiver through our limbs. We did not need words to understand what was happening. The forest was not marking us to claim territory. It was learning us. The symbols shifted again, settling into new configurations that felt finished. The pulse slowed, then steadied. Somewhere deep beneath the ground, something vast adjusted its attention, like a sleeper turning in its rest. The moon began to sink. As its light thinned, the markings faded, retreating beneath our skin until only faint discolorations remained. The forest relaxed, trees easing back into their places. Sound crept cautiously into the world. An insect's tentative chirr, the distant crack of a branch. We stood in silence, shaken, exhausted, hollowed out in places we couldn't name. In the morning, the path had returned. We left without speaking, carrying with us a shared understanding that nothing had ended. The forest had not attacked us. It had not trapped us. It had initiated something. Days later, far from the trees, we found the markings again. Not visible in ordinary light, but present all the same. We felt them when the moon rose, a faint warmth beneath the skin, a subtle pull of attention. Sometimes, in reflective surfaces, we noticed our eyes adjusting to darkness too quickly. Sometimes we woke with the sense that we had been standing somewhere else, listening. The markings no longer needed moonlight to exist. They were waiting, and whatever had begun beneath that pale forest sky was already continuing, patiently, inside us, reshaping memory, adjusting perception, preparing us for the next time the moonlight would reveal what we had become.